Hello everyone, welcome to my talk. Today I'm going to talk about biosampling of polymer conformation using the Brownian bridges. This work is a collaboration between me, Professor Ram Krishna, and Professor Narsimhan from Purdue University. We know that the sampling of the polymer can be existed depends on the scale of the system. For angstrom scales, typically simulation is called atomistic simulations. In a molecular scale, which is order of nanometers, the simulation conducted is the molecular dynamic simulations. The typical simulation time existed is around nanoseconds. For much larger polymer property approximation, one has to resort to the mesoscopic simulations. The length scale can be described as the order of micrometers, and the time is about microseconds to milliseconds. Since we're interested in the polymer conformation, we're focused on the mesoscopic simulations. The most important length existed in the polymer chain is the persistent length. If the length of the polymer chain is on the order of the persistent length, the polymer either can be regarded as a stiff or semi-flexible polymers. When the length of the polymer chain is much higher or larger than the persistent length, we call it flexible polymer chains. The polymer chain we're describing essentially is ideal chain. For ideal chain description, it assumes no volume exclude volume effect. The polymer can be described by a random walk. Such a polymer model can be also called Gaussian chain models. Mathematically, we're using stochastic differential equations to study the polymer chain. What it does, essentially, by growing the polymer from initial condition to the end condition, which is characterized by the contour length S. For this particular stochastic process, there are two terms. The first term is the drift term. The second term is the diffusion term, quantify the stochasticity. It depends on the complexity of the polymer chain. For Gaussian flexible polymer chain, the drift term can be neglected. One can characterize the growth of the polymer chain using the length of canoe length and contour length to characterize this diffusion process. On the other hand, for semi-flexible polymer chains, not only one has to look in at the positions, the tangent information has also been included. For such a system, both drift term and diffusion term will be a function of the persistence. Depends on different applications in the polymer sampling. In this particular cases, one can interested in the polymer sampling for rare events, which described a polymer conformation under free energy field, which happened in a very low probability. Or another application is polymer in external field. One is interested in the most probable configuration. Lastly, for polymer conformation, one of the study is to focus on their topology. For all these simulations, can be described as a sampling a random process with n conditions specified. To do so, we come up with an idea is using the Brownian bridge. While the concept of the Brownian bridge is not new, it has been applied to the stochastic control and the field of the finance, where people can look at the stock market. What we're interested is employing the Brownian bridge to look at polymer sampling. Essentially, a regional stochastic differential equations can only specify the initial conditions. With the bridge effort, not only we can focus on the start position, we also can specify the end position. Next slide, we're going to describe how do we do it. Again, we're showing a regional stochastic differential equations contributed by the drift and diffusion term. What bridge does is essentially an additional term contributed by the heating probability. What's physically meaning this biasing term is that this term acting as a force in terms of free energy overcoming the entropic barrier. The first example we're looking at here is to using Brownian bridge to realize a polymer ring, where essentially the polymer initial position are equals to the end positions. To do so, it turns out the heating probability is analytically known. One of the advantages of the Brownian bridge is that it actually can generate the ring with unbiased statistics. To test that, we compare the theory of the polymer ring with the simulation using the Brownian bridge. As you can see, the probability distribution in terms of polymer positions are consistent with each other. Now, in most situations, the heating probability is not analytically known. What should we do? What we did actually coming up approach to calculate the heating probability. Again, we first recalled original stochastic differential equations. It turns out the heating probability actually satisfies the Backward-Fokker-Planck equations are described as following. Now, in order to satisfy the end condition, essentially the initial condition of the Fokker-Planck equations. Once we calculate the heating probability from these PDEs, we actually can implement the bridge process. One caveat here is that we only need to solve this PDE once, then the bridge process is accomplished. Now let's look at how we realize the different problems. The second example we're trying to demonstrate is a single polymer chain in external field. It has been a fundamental research study for different applications. For instance, polyelectrolyte in electric field, or in a polymer field series, where the multi-body interaction of the polymer can be approximated by a single polymer chain in a fluctuating field. The methodology is described as following. Again, we're looking at an ideal polymer without potential. Now, in order to confer the external potential effect, additional parameter called accumulated weight functions, accumulated Boltzmann weight functions W. Now, the Backward-Fokker-Planck equations has to account for this effect, which including the external energy and also additional phase parameter W. Again, we have to specify the initial condition for end position of the polymer. Now, in order to verify our methodology, we're looking at a 1D polymer in a quadratic potential. There are two problems are existed where actually analytical solutions for the partition functions. The first one is when the 1D polymer both ends are clamped. Another one is the 1D polymer one end is clamped, another end is free. For the first cases, it turns out there is analytical solutions for the bridge term. As you can see, the partition functions are well aligned with each other. In the second question, when one end is clamped, another end is free, calculation of the partition function cannot be analytically given. Now, before going into the Brownian bridge, we're using the brute force or naive sampling approach to collect the statistics. What we found is interesting is when the polymer position, which is located at the minimum energy potential, the efficiency, which is quantified the fraction of the polymer simulations, quantified by the Boltzmann weight, larger than a certain values. It turns out this fraction is actually very high, representing very efficient samplings. However, when the polymer position, which is far away from the minimum potential, the sampling using naive sampling method is inefficient. What can be improved by using the Brownian bridge essentially is set up a threshold for the total Boltzmann weight in terms of epsilon. So the Brownian bridge can exclude the low weight contribution from the simulations. What we demonstrated here is that we're using the Brownian bridge by excluding different weight for different position polymer, we're able to efficiently calculating the partition function. We demonstrate this idea by calculating the radius of gyration. As shown here is again the 1D polymer. One end is fixed, another end is free. As you can see, naive sampling and Brownian bridge gave the consistent result. However, if we check the order of simulations, when the polymer far away from the minimum potential, the Brownian bridge is only taken 100 simulations. However, the naive sampling, in order to get the same order of statistics, it takes about 1 million simulations. Therefore, Brownian bridge can do 4-order magnitude of simulation for this particular example. To further illustrate the reasoning behind this process is by plotting the phase space in terms of Boltzmann weight. What we find is naive samplings are not biasing towards any Boltzmann weight, therefore is really inefficient. On the other hand, the Brownian bridge actually can focus on the high Boltzmann weight regions, therefore the simulation is very efficient. So far, we have studied what is the Brownian bridge as a biasing approach. In fact, in the literature, there's a multiple approach existed. For instance, umbrella samplings, adaptive bioforce, or metadynamics. Transition path method has been applied to the chemical reaction systems. Lastly, the non-equilibrium method. Now, the advantage of the bridge is it's statistically mechanically exact, therefore it has a good idea of the error estimation. However, the disadvantage is it has to solve the PDE in content curse of dimensionality. Now, our question is, how do we resolve the curse of dimensionality? To do that, we recall the original bias process in terms of Brownian bridge. Essentially, we have to solve the heating probability. Now, our approach, instead of solving it, we want to approximating this heating probability terms at pi. Now, the process is as such. Again, instead of solving the heating probability, we propose a biasing term. Secondly, we again treat this biasing term as a bridge process to perform the stochastic differential equations. Eventually, we collect the statistics. Finally, the property has to be unweighted by the W. The reason is that because our approximation is not exactly equals to heating probability. So the weighting function, which is a function of the L parameter originated from the Backward-Fokker-Planck equation, characterize how good our approximation is. When W close to 1, representing it's a good approximation. When W equals 0, meaning it's a bad approximation. Nonetheless, by performing enough samplings, we should be able to recover the property of any stochastic processes. To demonstrate this idea, we're looking at a 1D Wiener process. It turns out for this particular process, which is generally characterized by the drift A and the diffusion M, we can propose approximation for the heating probability in terms of function f and g, where f function and g function is in terms of drift A and diffusion coefficient M. For specific question, the first example we're looking at is a 1D geometric Brownian motions. Now, for this particular stochastic process, it turns out approximation are exactly equal to the bridge process. Therefore, those cases are well consistent with each other. On the other hand, when we're looking at Oyster and Uhlenbach, there is a little bit of differences because of the approximation. However, under a sample number around 2000, we were able to get very close to values with each other. Therefore, the bridge process are consistent with what approximation has done. In conclusion, in this work, we propose stochastic process controlled by the bridge to specify start and end regimes. In order to do so, we have to solve for heating probability from the Backward-Fokker-Planck equations. The methodology can be well applied to the most probable configuration type of problems. In addition, we're trying to extend this approach by using approximation of bridge to accelerate our calculations, particularly for high-dimensional systems. For the future work, we intend to extend this approximation method to the high-dimensional system. Once it is done, we can go beyond the flexible chains, for instance, to look at the semi-flexible chains, which has implications. For instance, in the cell biology, people are interested in the DNA histone complexes for the epigenetics or material science, for example, hydrogels. With that, I want to conclude my talk, and I thank Professor Vivek Narasimhan and also Professor Ramkrishna for this interesting questions. And I welcome any questions regarding this particular talk. Thank you.